The internet loves to end arguments with a single phrase. Well, it worked for me. But what happens when personal stories become debate ending weapons instead of meaningful insight? I was listening again to Alan Watts, that jocular archpriest of Anglo Zen, who spoke like a man permanently returning from a long lunch. He had this quality: the ideas were occasionally brilliant, occasionally half cooked, and always delivered with the authority of someone who had never once feared being wrong in public. Watts could be blunt, charming, occasionally reckless. The effect is that he makes you think. Often not about his ideas, but about why people believe things with such ferocious lightness. It was after one such talk, a meander about the self, that I found myself contemplating the thing that most reliably ruins earnest intellectual exchange: the anecdote, the personal story, the worked for me, the most seductive unimpeachability ever devised by the human psyche. Because the moment you say, this idea might be flawed, someone will inevitably lob back a small grenade of autobiography. Well, it helped me. End of discussion. Not the point has been won, but the ground has been withdrawn. An anecdote, if deployed strategically, is the perfect rhetorical exit door. You cannot argue with what is declared to be the deepest truth of someone's own life. Try to interrogate it, and you look cruel. Try to counter it, and you sound pedantic. The anecdote is both shield and sword, a little imperial outpost of personal experience waving away the empire of reason. Now, I saw this most starkly in a recent exchange online. I had written about how Jordan Peterson had invoked his beloved crustaceans, the dominance-driven lobster, serotonin-soaked and strutting his way to bourgeois respectability. I pointed out that the analogy was biologically unsound and philosophically suspect. Someone replied, "Well, this story worked for me." "Worked how?" I asked. No reply. The anecdote had done its job. It needed no elaboration. It was a dead end furnished with a moral. What does one do with such moments? How does one engage with a story that, by its nature, refuses engagement? Are anecdotes relevant in debate or even in good faith inquiry? My instinct is always absolutely not. They distract, distort, and derail. They are the intellectual equivalent of waving the waiter over before the conversation has even begun. But the matter is more complicated than my reflex disdain allows. Let us first consider the philosophical terrain. In Western epistemology, particularly post-Enlightenment knowledge, is supposed to be transferable, generalizable, testable. Hume would roll in his Scottish grave at the thought of founding argument on private impressions. Kant would demand we distinguish between the phenomenal feeling of "it worked for me" and the noumenal question of whether the idea holds water in the world of things in themselves. Contemporary analytic philosophy, the anecdote counts as the weakest possible justification, barely above "my horoscope told me so." Legal argument is even harsher. Evidence must be admissible, relevant, and whenever possible, corroborated. A lawyer who brings anecdotes into a courtroom without being compelled by cross-examination is a lawyer looking for new employment. The entire machinery of law exists to prevent the conflation of story with proof. We have rules against hearsay precisely because human beings are too easily seduced by the vividness of narrative. Rhetoric, too, has its warnings. Aristotle's rhetoric classifies anecdote as a subset of paradigmia, an illustrative example which he pointedly ranks below logical demonstration. Anecdotes may appeal to ethos, my experience makes me credible, or pathos, my story should move you, but they do almost nothing for logos. They are the rhetorical equivalent of sugar, quick, potent, and nutritionally void. And yet, if we cast our gaze outside the narrow corridors of Western rationalism, the picture shifts. In many global South traditions, African oral philosophy, for example, indigenous storytelling practices, or even the sutra traditions of the East, the anecdote is not decorative, but constitutive. Knowledge is transmitted through story not because people are irrational, but because lived experience is understood as a legitimate epistemic source. A Yoruba proverb contains more ethical instruction than a dozen analytic treatises. A Zen koan is an anecdote sharpened into a blade, intending to sever delusion. In such traditions, you do not strip the story from the argument. The story is the argument. What these perspectives expose is a cultural truth the West often forgets. Humans think in stories before we think in syllogisms. Even scientific paradigms require narrative coherence. Before evidence is marshaled, a conceptual story must be imaginable. So where does this leave our lobster lover, that stray Petersonite who swore the analogy had worked for them? Perhaps their story signals not the truth of Peterson's claim, but the psychological niche it manages to fill. The anecdote reveals use, not veracity. It tells us something about the believer, not the belief. This is the subtle distinction I find missing when anecdotes are brandished as trump cards. The problem is not the anecdote itself. It is the category error. Anecdotes are invaluable as data about human meaning-making. They tell us how ideas function subjectively, but they cannot, by definition, prove the objective truth of the ideas. They are deployed to defend. To say the lobster story worked for me is perfectly legitimate if one means it gave me courage, it helped me impose structure on my life, or it made sense of my chaos. What is illegitimate is using that personal meaning to claim universal insight. Therefore, this is how dominance hierarchies function. The first statement is anthropology. The second is metaphysics, and one ought not mistake a memoir for a model of reality. Alan Watts himself might smile at this distinction. He was perfectly aware that his Zen-infused monologues were not arguments, but provocations. Verbal cones meant to loosen rigid Western binaries. His stories weren't evidence. They were dissolving agents. He wasn't proving, he was unhinging. And perhaps this is partly why anecdotes trouble me. They pretend to dissolve, but instead congeal, offering certainty where ambiguity would be healthier. So, how to conclude? Perhaps like this. Anecdotes matter, but not in the way their defenders insist. They are not proofs. They are symptoms. They reveal why people cling to certain narratives, not whether those narratives should be clung to. The task, if we are serious about thought, is to keep meaning and truth from collapsing into one another. Stories teach us how people experience ideas. Arguments teach us how to evaluate them. The anecdote belongs in the conversation, but only if we let it occupy its proper place, not as the arbiter of truth, but as the human trace left on the surface of the argument, a fingerprint that hints at why the idea was handled in the first place.